And I think that the diversity of the focus of each of the 4 papers is a tribute to Johan's organizational skills in putting together a very diverse program, which has given us insight into many of the very considerable complexities that there are in relation to managing multilingualism both nationally and supranationally, meaning in the EU system. And from that point of view, I think it is an excellent afternoon here for really clarifying many of the fundamental challenges and needs in this area. I don't think summing up can do justice to what we've heard from all of the various papers, so I won't attempt to do that. But I will try to make a few comments about some of the individual papers. I think that we had a very good presentation by Christina of what the EU is trying to do. And as she said herself, these are recommendations rather than orders or anything that has legal effect in any real sense. And that in itself says something about the difficulties of the whole interface between the supranational and the national, because all the countries are very different in how they see these things working through. I do think, though, that one of the difficulties seen from a member state is that if you invent something like a European education area or European universities, the label itself somehow questions whether we don't already have universities that are European. Obviously we do. We have a long history of that, and with, as Linus was just saying, there's been a history of a diversity of academic languages within those institutions for centuries, and it's shifting over time, of course. But that means that in itself, the sort of the labeling can perhaps not be terribly productive, and that makes it. It's also an example of how complex these things are. I also think that in relation to this business of research production being so diverse, and I think that Linus is just his comment a moment ago about the fact that there's a difference between publishing, disseminating, and being creative. And it's a fact that most people are more creative in their mother tongue, or possibly if you actually emigrate to Australia, it may become English over 20 or 30 years or whatever. And I think Rainer Enrique Hamel from Mexico has made this very clear. One needs, when talking about language policy, for instance, worry about whether English is replacing Swedish as a medium of instruction, English medium universities and so on. There's a huge difference between producing knowledge, between disseminating knowledge, and the teaching or learning situation. Those are 3 quite different categories of language use. And then also in relation to diversity of productions, he mentioned very interesting studies in this area, trying to clarify what's really at stake. There's also a very interesting study by 3 universities from the University of Cambridge with extremely un-British names, who went to Google to look at the number of publications in the field of environmentalism. And it's a fact that the English overweight there is only 63%. There are very large numbers of publications in Portuguese, in Spanish, in French, in Chinese, in Japanese, and even Chinese and Japanese are probably not included in those figures either, because who, when they're trying to quantify relative success in publication, knows anything about what's really being published in China? And that in itself is a problem, because the argument then is that any scholar who's only functioning in English is missing out on important things that are being generated in other languages. And that in itself also means that this obsession with publishing in English should not in any way be seen as gospel. Things are much more complex than that, and one therefore needs to retain academic freedom as a principle. And the more universities can do to strengthen that, the better, because it is also a fact that academic freedom is actually being restricted in many parts of the world, and insecurity in employment in higher education is a massive issue, which has to do with working conditions for younger people being much worse than they were when our generation were employed. I wondered whether when Marianne was talking about multimodal things, whether music comes into this in any big way, because I think it's there has been some empirical work funded by the European Union on the fact that people who are musical are often better language learners. And whether this is something that our brains can monitor in some way, I would love to know. But there are obviously interesting features there to do with research in what's happening in our brains when we are evolving in a more multilingual way. I do, in fact, use 4 languages every day, more or less, so that I know many of the issues that have been presented here are existential realities for all of us. I did make a handbook because, sorry, a handout. No, I've written books, and the fact that I've written books about European language policies is a sign that I do think the issues are so complex that they need book-length treatment in order to do justice to what happens in the institutions of the European Union and the forces that are influencing things, both in member states and in the European itself. So far as Marco's very provocative comments on the ineffectiveness of things in the EU system are concerned, I think that if you look at the opening page of my handout, you'll see that about the 6th point there is that there was a public hearing on the management of multilingualism by the institution, which was commissioned by the Ombud, who it's an Irish lawyer at the moment who has that role. And she got input from lots of people. Unfortunately, not enough people. Very few of the European Union institutions replied on how they manage multilingualism. But she has now published recommendations, and my printer didn't. Do you have color there for the website? You do have the website address. Okay, but that's great. So university's printer is rather better than mine. I have a blank there. But basically, there are extremely interesting recommendations there, which actually do answer some of Marco's questions about how the EU functions. Point 1, establish a clear policy on the use of EU's official languages in your EU institution. Secondly, publish it on your website. Thirdly, see to it that the policy is complied with and done consistently. Fourthly, ensure that restrictions on the use of official languages are objective, proportionate, and transferable. Oh, no, I can't even read my own handwriting here, I'm sorry. And so on. I mean, but basically there are very clear ways in which the shift into English being the dominant in-house language can be in fact challenged and might be changed in some way, which would be to the advantage of both permanent bureaucrats employed by the system who have their own logic, but also interaction with member states and with the public and so on. So that there are very good recommendations there for how to strengthen multilingualism. But you can find that on the website. And I think one of the interesting things there is that further down on that same page, you can see I've written that the Court of Justice of the European Union, that's the one in Luxembourg, not the one in Strasbourg. They have an incredibly important role, and you've probably read about this in relation to conflicts with Poland and Hungary recently. They have a huge caseload. There are a very large number of judges employed there from all the member states. And I've been looking into this over the last couple of years, so there's nothing about it in my books, actually. But what is extremely interesting is that Marco mentioned the term procedural languages. Within the Commission, that means the 3 dominant languages, English, French, and German, for the benefit of the commissioners for their weekly meeting. Everything has to be in those 3 languages. In the Court of Justice, procedural languages is all 24 languages. If somebody from any member state wants to go to court And there are, as I say, there's a huge caseload there. They are entitled to use their national language in all of the negotiations to clarify whether it's a strong case, what the objections are, and so on and so on. And then depending on the level in the system, the results will be sent out to in all relevant languages for each individual case. But at the very highest level, it is French still, which is a decision that predates the establishment of the Union. It's from the European coal and steel community, even older. But I had a very interesting seminar that I took part in the Sorbonne quite recently with judges and people from outside and academics and so on. And it really did convince me that to have a single exclusive language at the highest level, which happens to be French, works extremely well just because procedural languages are all used in the intermediate phases in order to try to ensure justice for people. So that in that institution, it's logical that there is a single dominant language, whereas that's not the case, obviously, in the Parliament or in the Commission, which means that the challenges in those institutions are very different. And the last thing on this first page I would like to mention, if Jonas doesn't stop me, is the last but two there. A lot of Commission activity marginalizes other languages. And I mentioned the DG, the Directorate for Research and Innovation, as it's called. And it's a fact that you are entitled, and any of you who are academics applying for money, you're entitled to use any of the 24 official languages. But it is also there in writing that if you're stupid enough not to do it in English, you have to provide a translation in addition. They don't put it in those terms quite, but it means that the pressure on everyone to submit in English is massive, so that for any researchers who are using a Romance language or a Finno-Ugric language as the dominant research language of that network in half a dozen countries, they are at a disadvantage, and this is actually a structural weakness there. The second structural weakness, of course, is that the people who go in as experts to assess all the applications, and I've done this several times, they are obviously using English only. And some of them use it well, others less so. So again, there are all sorts of structural challenges there, which mean that getting justice in relation to getting research money is snarled up in various ways. I'll quickly turn over and mention something, because this whole business about norms of language in education systems, obviously that's a standard that you're expected to achieve when it comes to production in speech or writing. Obviously, in terms of reception, reading skills, listening skills, it's much more diverse because all languages are diverse when it comes to that. But that there is a standard. If you're interested in the whole question of standard language, I suggest that you read what there is in the third bullet. I'm afraid there is this only military. On the issue of standard English, John O'Regan's very new book called Global English and Political Economy basically points out over 4 centuries how the British Empire and later the American Empire has in fact used a standard form of English for international work. And this is explained century by century in great detail right up to the present day. And if you think of the Glasgow COP meeting of the last week or so, the UN has 6 languages. These COP meetings are UN meetings. Which language was used in Glasgow? Well, obviously it was an English-only event, and that confirms that that form of written and spoken language is a very distinct, well-established form, which is primarily American with some British English in it. And it's not really, I mean, I think the distinctions when it comes to the written language, as you said, are absolutely minor. But this is a confirmation of, at the present, the dominant form of English having that nature. And that's what education systems have to address and use. The book is interesting because John O'Regan has a background in Chinese studies, and he's very much into monitoring what's happening. And I've written this here as well. The US is currently challenged by China along 4 parameters: production, finance, security, and knowledge. Definitely, I mean, research published in China is at least as important as everything in the West now. And the Chinese are going to use it. We know that. They're like that. So that, and I mean, China's also using soft power, the Confucius Institutes, which are extremely controversial everywhere. But he's basically, in this book, not only charting the establishment of this form of global English, but he's also seeing whether Chinese is in fact undermining that monopoly. And I think this is very important for anyone younger than me in the room, because this is going to become much more of an issue as time goes on. Can I? 4 minutes, yes, okay. I'll mention the law library at the University of London. I've spoken to its representative. No, I mean somebody from the law faculty. You don't represent it, no, of course. No, I mean, I went to the library there when I got involved in this whole business about the functioning of the European Union Court of Justice. The library has lots of journals on European law in English, 1 or 2 in German and Swedish, nothing in French. And obviously that's stupid. Lawyers and politicians should, in fact, become proficient in French as well. And I'm told that there are plenty who are actually intent on doing that, at least receptively. But I mean, that's also an important step in the right direction. And I would also say that our politicians ought to know German as well. In other words, to understand the significance of how people think in that country down the road, which historically has had a massive influence. And German was the first foreign language in most of Northern Europe until 1948 or something like that, when change happened. So my final point here, apart from suggestions for further reading for anyone who has time like that, what is common in the EU at the moment? Obviously, it's a common market. And it's important, and I write this somewhere else in the handbook, the European Union is as much an American project as a European one. If you look at the history of what was being decided in American think tanks during the war, and who decided how things should be evolved after that, it was deep involvement by the Americans, and there are books on all of that. And clearly the Federalists are aiming at the United States of Europe. And even Angela Merkel said last week that she's very unsure about whether we're now going to have a union of nations or a United States of Europe. So that clearly those are very big issues there. So we have a common market, which is what the Americans wanted. We have a common law. We have policies in an incredible number of topics. And that's where I get information every day from the Commission in Copenhagen. I mean, the number of topics that the EU is dealing with is infinite. Common foreign policy? Well, that's been decided on as desirable, but obviously it's not a reality. Do we have a common language? No, definitely not. Should we have a common language policy? That's what we're debating here, and I think that that's what we've had a very good start in trying to clarify the parameters of today. Thank you, Jonas. Thank you.